Well, thank you all for the invitation to speak today. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Let me know in the chat if that's not the case. While we're waiting for the slides to appear, let me just say that the digital calibration certificate initiative that I imagine you were hearing about later today, and I'm sure most of you know about it already. Let me just say that I'm in awe of that program. I just think it's a majestic achievement. But I'd have to say as well that I find it hard to imagine that that those rigorous protocols could be carried over into the testing arena. I don't know calibration well, but I do know testing very well. You know, it's incredibly messy and disorganized. It's splintered into tiny industry groups, and it's, you know, filled with national standards that don't correlate on any global level. So I applaud everything that is being done in the calibration area, and I do wonder how translatable it is into testing. In terms of the digital calibration certificate initiative, there's already talk about extending that to accreditation scopes for calibration. Which is, again, a wonderful and amazing concept, but one that I think, again, is going to be very difficult to translate into the testing arena and the certification arena, for that matter. You're probably, the audience is probably also aware of another initiative that's going on, which is the trade measurement digital pathways. And in fact, I'm involved in a pilot in Australia with our NMI around this. And this is the idea that consumers can scan, you know, their local supermarket scales or what have you to validate the calibration status. Now, you know, this idea of taking mobile phone readers and then linking back to the underlying data, it can be done in many different ways. I guess there's an interesting crossover there, isn't there, with the digital calibration certificate initiative, because calibration laboratories are involved in both cases, and we hope that these two initiatives will sort of marry up in a nice way. Otherwise, laboratories will be sort of, you know, the meat in the sandwich, so to speak. But what I'll be talking about today is not about calibration. It's about product claims. You know, if someone says that this tomato sauce, you know, is salt-free or low sugar or whatever, that's a claim. And how is that claim proved? That will be the subject of my talk. But I hope that you'll see through this presentation that there are crossovers into the digital calibration space almost at every turn. So the initiative that I'm involved in seeks to answer three big questions. We want to know how to easily link information about the competence of organisations issuing conformity certificates. We can call that accreditation credentialing if you like, and it applies in the calibration space as well. We also want to enable unique linkages between certificates and the exact physical goods that certificates relate to. Now that doesn't exist at the moment in the analog world, but things could go horribly haywire if we can't get a handle on this when we move to the digital world. And the last question that we want to address is, can we track inspections and tests that occur along the supply chain and then capture that within the supply chain data flow? Now, all of those are tough questions, as I'm sure you might acknowledge, but a group of collaborators set out to solve all three of them if we could. And we, in fact, we released a report. We released a draft report internationally, but we've already published a domestic report in Australia, which is available on the NATA website. I'm just trying to get my clicker to work here. It's a bit non-responsive. Perhaps, Tom, could you move the next slide for me? Thank you very much. So the work that we've done revolves around things called global identifiers. The WTO very helpfully made a list of these and published it in their standards toolkit for cross-border paperless trade. Chief among these identifiers is the GTIN. That's what's on all your supermarket goods. That's what you use when you go to your self-checkout at a supermarket. So it's the basis of retail product identification. There's a few other standards listed. These are all ISO standards. The other ones listed help us to track goods down to the level of a shipping container or a shipment, like a pallet load, and even down to an individual marked item if that's needed. And the last one on the list relates not to products but to documents. It's the document type identifier, the GDTI, and I'll come back to that one in a moment. There's a syntax around this. You can see in the middle of the screen there's a GTIN, perhaps from a bottle of tomato sauce or something, and that's encoded into effectively a web address. The data matrix that you see over in the top corner, it goes beyond a GTIN barcode. It encodes all of the information that you can see, which includes a batch number in this case, and then a serial number, which could be a proprietary thing, and an expiry date. And then all of this is encoded into a web address that a user could manually interrogate, or indeed a machine could send queries to. Now these global standards are, nothing really that new. They're used all over the place wherever traceability is critical. Now in product flow, at least, there is an absolute blind spot or missing link, and that link is the disconnect between all of the conformity assessment certificates and the actual physical delivery. So when we're talking about conformity assessment outcomes, we're talking about what certification bodies do, what inspection bodies do, sampling agencies and test laboratories, all of whom generate certificates, and all of those bodies are subject to accreditation coverage. Now, in Australia, the sampling and laboratory activities are covered by NATA. In New Zealand, it's done by the fine people at IANZ. And in the case of certification, interestingly, it's covered by the same organisation across both countries, and that's JASANZ. Hopefully you're aware of their role. But the point of this slide is to show that none of these certificates that are generated are actually connected with the physical product delivery in any sense. Now, people along the supply chain will try and make connections. They'll say, oh, that pallet of goods that we delivered to you, here's the test certificate, or here's a certification for it. But what basis is there really to believe that? Now, I mentioned GTIN before. Here's an example of a GTIN in use. This is a real physical product tag. You can see the data matrix encodes, among other things, the GTIN. It happens to encode the batch number as well. There's nothing startling about this. This is pretty par for the course. But the next slide takes things a step further. So now we can see, and again, this is a real certificate that belongs to the product tag that I showed you in the last slide. This is a test report for that batch of steel, and it has a data matrix. Now, this is starting to get interesting because we're no longer talking about product identification and traceability. We're now into the conformity data. So this data matrix encodes a GDTI, which is no surprise, given the WTO list that I showed you before. And this GDTI identifies the issuer, that is InfraBuild, but it also enables a serialization. And in this case, the company has serialized their delivery docket for that steel supply. They could have serialized something else if they'd wanted to. And you can also append further sets of information into the GDTI if you want to. Now, this company hasn't chosen to. So I think this is interesting up to a point, but let's be honest. In this case, the laboratory, InfraBuild, and the supplier are the same company. So we could say, well, that's no great achievement. So let's think then, what if the laboratory was a third-party independent body that was coming into this manufacturer to test the product? What would that system look like? So the concept then is a web-based pathway to discover linked conformity data for products, batches, containers, shipments, whatever, and to make visible the anchors of trust for each of those conformity data elements. You know, was this certificate, this conformity data certificate, issued under a recognised scheme or program? Was it subject to third-party accreditation, perhaps through IANS or JASANS? And was it subject to a global MRA or MLA? So that we can see, you know, the progressively building anchors of trust that separates the programs that we know and love, the 17025, 17065 and so forth, globally recognised programs. It sets those apart from some, you know, local domestic industry run program, which, you know, doesn't have the same global anchors of trust involved. Under this concept, the certificate issuers host their own data and set access rules. So the laboratory that came in to test the steel, for example, would have a cloud, interrogable cloud database of those certificates that they issue. And the whole thing would be interrogable by a mobile phone app, by a human consumer, end consumer, or probably more importantly, amenable to machine trade platform queries as trade platforms increasingly go digital. So schematically, it would look something like this, where there's a resolver or gateway, if you like, that you access through a public URL. But the resolver knows where all the certificates are. And so if you ask about a certificate or about a product, the resolver can scurry away and find all of the connected data and bring it back to you according to the permission rules. Now, it might not have permission to show you a test report, but it could tell you that a test report exists and that it applies to that batch and that it's a valid certificate. That would be a step in the right direction. If in the case of certifications, those are most likely public documents, so you could read the full certification details if you were interested. The idea is that it's based on the same global identifiers that I mentioned earlier on. The architecture is run on open global standards. It is a freely accessible network that carries out authentication of documents and validation, even if you can't see the whole certificate. And because the standards are based on common systems used around the world, it aligns with other network design concepts that are underway, like the UE Green Deal. Now, the premise here is that individual countries could all do quite different things, quite legitimately so, but if they use the same global identifiers, and why wouldn't they, these interfaces could all interconnect. And so that if you were in Japan looking at an Australian can of tomatoes or bottle of tomato sauce, and you wanted to scan the barcode, within your Japanese interface, behind the scenes, that interface could head over to let's say the Australian interface and ask about those certificates, and then bring them back without the user ever leaving the Japanese interface. So that's the great goal, and we presented this to a global roundtable last week to great interest and support. Now, you quite rightly can chastise me there, and with my map, I chopped it off at the Tasman Sea, and so I didn't have to make a call about a New Zealand interface. But here's an interesting question. Given that JASANS operates across both Australia and New Zealand, wouldn't it be interesting to think if there could be a mutual interface across our region? So I don't know where that's going to go, or indeed where this whole concept is going to go. But we think we're onto a good idea, and we're going to keep discussing this with various authorities. I don't know where it will lead, but I think, given that we're talking about calibration today, I think one very interesting area here is the connection with what's going on with the digital calibration certificate initiative and what we're trying to achieve. It would be good if we could carve out an approach which suited both systems, wouldn't it? Because otherwise the labs and the accreditation bodies actually are going to be trying to run competing systems. Now, if it turns out that these initiatives continue to run on different trajectories, well, that's just one more complication that we'll need to overcome. But I think either way, it promises to be a very interesting ride. So I might stop there. I could probably talk about this subject all day because it is a vast topic. But perhaps I've borrowed heavily on your attention already. So let me finish there. Thank you.